Taxing the environment at the OECD, there are three principal elements. We start, and perhaps the biggest focus of our work is on carbon pricing. And we have taxing energy use, but we have the accompanying publication and data set which relates to effective carbon rates. We also have a range of working papers and are constantly involved in work with a focus on carbon pricing, particularly around questions of design and the political economy questions, such as competitiveness and affordability. We are also focused on a range of other environmental taxes and tax incentives, and we have many pieces of work either out there already published or in the pipeline. But for example, we have the diesel differential working paper, company car support working paper, and more recently the energy affordability paper. And then we do country work. And this is really about applying the insights of all of our analytical work into a country-specific context. And that's ongoing, and we continue to work with a number of countries in terms of their particular local focus. But today is about taxing energy use, and it's worth just reflecting for a moment on the history of how we got to where we are today. So taxing energy use first launched in 2013 with OECD countries being the focus of the publication at that point, and country profiles. Now, it is unique in the detail that is presented on tax rates by sector and by fuel, and the importance of the way in which the material is presented is that it's in a completely comparable way. In 2015, we released the second report, which, in addition to the OECD countries, expanded to include 7 non-OECD countries. And when you put those countries together, they account for around 80% of global energy use. And then we move forward right through to today. And today we're launching the third report, which has the 42 OECD and G20 economies, and involves for the first time a comparison across time between 2012 and 2015 data. And Kurt will talk a little bit more about the data a little bit later on. And of course, the intention is to continue to update this work into the future. So what are we releasing today? Well, there are two elements. The first one is the report, Taxing Energy Use, the companion. And the second element are the country notes. These are graphical profiles. The link is provided there, and it's really, really helpful to have a look visually at the presentation of our results. So what are the key findings? Now, I'll just spend a few moments giving some focus to those key findings before I hand over to Johanna, who will take us through the detail. But firstly, we see that energy taxes differ strongly between country sectors and fuels. But almost all taxes are too low. We see that despite its large environmental impact, coal is taxed at the lowest rates and, in fact, in most cases, continues to be fully untaxed. Outside of road transport, we see that rates are below a low-end estimate of climate costs for 97% of emissions. When it comes to road fuel taxes, we know that they're higher, but even still, they are too low to take into account the other external costs that these taxes should be pricing into the cost of fuel. And taxes tend to be higher where GDP per capita is higher, but there are some notable exceptions. It's not all bad news. Fuel tax reforms in some large economies have increased the share of emissions taxed above climate costs in road transport. And some countries are removing lower tax rates on diesel compared to gasoline. And this was an issue that we highlighted in the working paper on the diesel differential, but we are seeing action from a number of countries. But despite some encouraging initiatives on the country level, the fact remains that progress towards more consistent application of the polluter pays principle remains low. And that leads to our key policy conclusions around where we need to be heading in the future. But now I'll hand over to Johanna, who will take us through the detail of the results that we're presenting in taxing energy use today.
Thank you very much for highlighting these key findings of the Taxing Energy's 2018 report. I'll now present these findings in a little bit more detail, but of course you can find further analysis, numbers and contracts in the report that we have here and online as well. We also have a number of country profiles that provide detail, and at this point, thanks a lot also to Melanie and Jonas, who've been very helpful in finalizing all the material associated with this report. So I'll discuss these results in two parts. I'll start with the diagnosis for 2015. That's provide an overview of energy taxes by sector, different countries, and across different fuel types. And I'll then talk about the main changes that we observed between 2012 and 2015. So what do we actually find? Well, as David already said, we find that a large majority of emissions are not priced in line with even a very conservative estimate of the climate costs of 30 euros per ton of carbon. And this graph actually illustrates this finding quite nicely. So it's a distribution of tax rates in 2015 for the 42 OECD and G20 countries that we include in the study. And carbon emissions from energy use are plotted on the horizontal axis, sorted from the least taxed on the left to the highest taxed on the right. And tax rates expressed in euros per ton of carbon are plotted on the vertical axis. Carbon emissions are actually plotted separately for road transport in dark blue, and for all of the non-road sectors, so industry, electricity, and residential and commercial mainly, in light blue. But what do these lines tell us? Well, we can see that almost all, so 97% of emissions from road transport are taxed, and 50% of these are taxed at or above the climate cost of 30 euros per ton of carbon. Again, the low-end estimate that we're taking here. This picture is very different when we look outside of road transport, so the light blue line, where 85% of emissions occur in these 42 countries. So the large majority of emission occurs there. Outside of road transport, 81% of emissions are entirely untaxed and 97% are taxed below the low-end estimate of climate cost. So this is very disconcerting if we think about the great potential that energy and carbon taxes could have in shifting our economies towards a low carbon economy. And it gets worse when we actually realize that fossil fuel combustion has many other external costs that are not even taken into account in the low-end estimate of climate costs that we take here. So for example, air pollution. But of course, there are large differences in how the 42 countries that we analyze tax the fuels. So we're now going to take a look at the cross-country variation. So this graph shows countries' average tax rates in and outside of road transport again, and the bubble size here represents the share of emissions that occur in the individual sectors, so in road and non-road transport. So first of all, this graph allows appreciating the differences in effective tax rates between the different countries, but it also shows the large differences that occur between taxes in the road and non-road sectors. And here, again, a key takeaway is that countries with higher per capita GDP tax emissions at higher rates, but of course, we also observe that some high-income countries tax emissions at lower levels. So these are plotted to the right. But the taxing energy use data does not only allow us to compare taxes across different sectors, but we can also look at different tax rates across the different fuel types, so coal and oil products, for example. So this graph is a similar illustration of the data. So again, tax rates are plotted on the vertical axis, and we can see the different countries on the horizontal axis. Again, there are vast differences in how countries tax different fuels, but we can notably observe from this graph that coal, which is represented here with the black-green bubbles, is taxed at the lowest rates, although it accounts for 50% of the carbon emissions from energy use in the 42 countries. So coal is really taxed at the lowest rates overall. Just 5 countries of the 42 tax coal at above 5 euros per ton of carbon. And most countries, and actually the largest emitters, tax coal not at all. In contrast, oil products are taxed relatively highly in all of the countries. So having looked at the inter-country details of how these individual countries tax energy, we'll now zoom out again to see at at the aggregate numbers and to look at the aggregate numbers across the 42 countries. So this graph shows a lot of detail, actually. It summarizes the full energy tax profiles across the 42 countries. And this type of graph is also available online for the 42 countries individually, but this is really the summary profile of the 42 countries. So this graph divides carbon emissions from energy use by the different sector in which they occur along the horizontal axis. So again, we can see the road sector, but then we can also see the different sectors outside of road. So for example, notably industry, electricity, and the residential and commercial sector. But not only can we observe from which sector the carbon emissions occur, but we can also identify which fuel they originate from. So for example, you can see along the horizontal axis, both in the industry sector and in the electricity sector, a lot of the carbon emissions are from coal and coke use. So just quickly to summarize the main takeaways from this graph. Taxes, again, are relatively high in the road sector and they're very low in the other sectors, but there are some differences also outside of the road transport. So in general, the residential and commercial sector, so households, are taxed more highly than the industry sector, and electricity in general is taxed at the lowest rates. Just quickly to focus in on the road sector, so we can see that in this graph, actually, the diesel is taxed at higher rates in the aggregate, but 40 out of the 42 countries actually tax diesel at a lower effective rate than gasoline, and more context on this particular detail of the graph is provided in the report. So I've been saying, well, the taxes in the road sector are relatively high, but are they high enough or are they even too high, since on average these taxes exceed the climate costs in this sector? The answer is that these taxes still remain too low from an externality pricing point of view, because if we take account of all of the different external costs that occur in road transport, so be it air pollution, congestion, that occur from fuel use in road transport, these taxes are still too low. So this is the diagnosis for 2015. To put it very simple, the large majority of emissions is not taxed, and where they are, all of these tax rates are too low. But perhaps, well, at least the direction of travel that we're going in is the right one. So is it? I'll try to provide an answer in what comes in the following by comparing the effective tax rates in 2015 to the 2012 ones. Again, always separating between the road and the non-road sectors. So this again is a distribution of the tax rates, but this time we do focus exclusively on the road sector. And again, the 2015 rates is plotted, but this time we compare it with the 2012 rates. Are these lines very different from each other? Yes, they are different. So we see some change between 2012 and 2015 in the middle of the distribution, so at around 50 to 100 euros per ton of carbon. And then we also see some changes at the higher end of the distribution. And we'll see in just a second where these changes come from and which countries actually drive these changes. What do we see when we look outside of the road sector? Well, actually, we don't see that much. There are some increases around the effective tax rates of 50 euros per ton of carbon, but these increases are relatively modest in the aggregate. And for all practical purposes, I think we can say that these changes are very, very small. This is not to say that there are not also notable initiatives in carbon price increases outside of the road sector on the country level, which we'll focus on in a second as well. So which countries actually drive these changes? We can see, so this graph actually plots effective tax rates between 2012 and 2015 in percentage change in local currency units, again, just in the road sector. And we see that for the fuel taxes in the road sector, the largest increases in percent have occurred in Mexico, India, and China. And these countries actually have reformed their fuel taxes quite strongly in the time horizon that we're looking at. And since these countries account for a relatively large share of carbon emissions too, these three countries are really at the origin of the change that we saw before when we looked at the distribution of tax rates in the road sector. Again, outside of road, what has happened? This is the same figure, and it plots the percentage change in effective tax rates outside of the road sector. But of course, these changes are larger when we take them as a percent because they occur from a lower base. So the changes do look bigger. We have seen that actually the change has been relatively limited in the aggregate, but now we can appreciate the change on a country level as well. So what has happened in the individual country? I'll just highlight a few of the countries that have increased their tax rate quite strongly. So for example, France has introduced a carbon tax in 2014, which is leading to actually quite some significant increases in tax rates for the non-ETS sectors. And also these changes are focused on the non-road sectors. New carbon taxes have also been introduced in Japan, in the United Kingdom, and also in Mexico. And also here we see some relatively large changes. And in all of these countries, the change is concentrated in the non-road sectors. And then let me also just briefly highlight Korea and India, which both have introduced quite a wide-ranging tax on coal that also applies to the coal use in electricity. And thus, in these countries, we see also quite a large increase in the effective tax rates. So I'll now hand over to Kurt, who will summarize these highlights and conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and good day or good night maybe to some people online. I'll indeed very quickly summarize. I would first like to thank Johanna and also Melanie and Jonas, who've done a tremendous amount of work collecting these data and getting them organized in the hopefully accessible way that you see here. It's really just the tip of the iceberg that you see here. It's a tremendous amount of work that went in there. The summary, well, we saw 3 cuts of the data for 2015, and we have 3 messages. First of all, most taxes on energy use are low. They're low in an absolute sense. 0, I think we can all agree, is a low number. Low levels of taxes, also too low from a climate point of view. The taxes don't even cover the external cost of climate, let alone other external costs in most cases. So energy taxes are not reaching their potential as environment policy instruments, not in 2012, not in 2015. Well, there are large differences that one can observe. There are big differences between countries. There are big differences between fuels. The low taxes on fuels stand out. The taxes on oil products are comparatively high. Big differences between sectors. It's been mentioned that the transport sector, road transport, that's where we find relatively the highest tax rates. With a big careful message there. It doesn't mean that even if these taxes now exceed estimates of the climate damage of emissions, 30 euros, 60 euros, often the taxes in road transport are higher. This does not mean that they're high enough. There are other external costs related to air pollution, perhaps also related to congestion, if you think that you want to use fuel taxes to cut congestion. So high, maybe an absolute amount, but not high enough if you think of road fuel taxes as environmental policy instruments. We compared 2015 to 2012. Johanna showed there is some change, but it is limited. There's not that much change in the aggregate picture. We know that there's been change in a couple of countries and big efforts made in a couple of countries. But the aggregate picture, except for road transport in the middle of the distribution, there's really not that much change that we find between those 2 years. Now, we compare 2015 to 2012. Of course, one can ask why 2015, not why 2017. Well, I mean, that's sort of the price that we pay for being comprehensive and having all the detail that we have in the database. It's just not possible to move that fast, to move to 2017 with the degree of detail that we have here. Would there be bigger change if we compared 2017 to 2015? Well, we are working to update some of the databases already again, and we are doing some work that we hope to publish in the second half of this year. I'll come back to that. On the basis of that, we have some kind of view, not a really detailed, comprehensive view yet, but we have some kind of view which allows us to say that we think if you would compare 2017 to 2015, that the rate of change would actually not be faster than the one that you saw here. So it's not like the 2015 perspective makes our data obsolete already. That's really not the case. They show a message which is still highly relevant now. This may be a bit surprising. I mean, those that follow up on carbon pricing and emission trading systems and energy taxation in general, we know there's a lot of debate. We know there are a lot of country initiatives. Joanna mentioned some of them. There's France, where there's a lot going on. We have Canada, with a mix of trading systems and tax approaches. We had Portugal. We had a lot of movement in Mexico. We had Chile that introduced the carbon tax. So there's a lot of movement. It may be a little bit surprising that this does not translate into big changes in the aggregate picture, but that is what we find, and that's what continues until today. So is that a pessimistic message or an optimistic one? Well, I think you can look at it two ways. The fact that we have all these initiatives in all these countries means that at least these mechanisms, these systems are being put in place. So there is a lot of initiative. And if the momentum increases, then we can be hopeful that coverage will become broader than it currently is and that rates will be higher than they currently are. So we can be hopeful in that sense. There's no need for excessive pessimism. If you look at a couple of countries, if you look at Canada, if you look at France, there's really reasons to be hopeful that things will change. So that's sort of the summary. I'm going to take the opportunity, if you allow me, to mention a new OECD initiative, which is called the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting, an initiative that was launched recently at the One Planet Summit here in Paris last December. It's endorsed at this point by France and Mexico. This is convened by the OECD, which will work in a close partnership with governments. What's the purpose of this initiative? Well, it's written down on the slide. The idea is to work towards alignment of national budgetary processes with the Paris Agreement and with other environmental goals. So the idea is here to approach the environmental question, the climate question, not just from the environment angle, but also from the tax policy angle, the fiscal policy angle, the budgetary angle. We know, for example, that for climate policy, we're not looking at, correcting the economic system that we have a little bit. We're looking at a transformation. So we have to look across government, which means that tax and fiscal policy and budgetary policy really have to be part of the entire policy drive if we want to make this work. And the Paris Collaborative on Green Budgeting is an initiative to try to get there. Of course, those of us in the OECD that work on tax and environment questions, we report to the joint meetings of tax and environment experts. So we're acutely aware of the types of dialogues and types of differences of view that one can have if tax people and environment people are around the table. We also know that getting them together is a very important way of trying to get support going forward across government for climate policy and environment policy in general. So, we look forward to working under this Paris Collaborative and trying to push the policy agenda forward. Tax and environment at the OECD, I'm just going to end by listing a couple of recent and forthcoming publications that relate to tax and environment. So effective carbon rates is a publication that we first released in 2016 and that we will release an update of in 2018. What is effective carbon rates? Well, effective carbon rates, in a sense, starts from the taxing energy use work that Johanna and David just summarized. So it has the taxes on energy use in there, but it adds to that the information, equally comprehensive and detailed information on emissions trading systems. So it adds the price signals of emissions trading systems and of taxes to arrive at a full estimate and detailed estimate of the carbon price that we call the effective carbon rate. So at the end, in the second half of this year, you will see a new version of that report. On the basis of the 2016 publication, I can very quickly say perhaps that adding the price signals from emissions trading systems to the tax systems does actually not really change the picture that was shown on the basis of the taxes alone in any fundamental way. That's other, let's say, statistical indicator work that we do. We also work on political economy aspects of carbon pricing and environmental taxation, questions of incidence, so who gets hit hardest, questions of affordability, so if energy prices rise, does it pose problems for some households, and what can we do about it? We also work on competitiveness impacts, competitiveness in the short run, competitiveness in the long run. What happens if you start changing energy prices? In the context of all the work, we also work on carbon pricing design. So one of our big concerns and one of the big messages from the taxing energy use work is, political economy, so equity issues, affordability issues, competitiveness issues, they are important, obviously. We can do something about them where we need, but we should do it in a way that does not compromise the environmental effectiveness of the price signal. And we have a range of papers that go in depth into these questions. And then, as David already said, we have country analysis that we apply to Mexico, Costa Rica, for example, amongst others. And this is where I'll stop and I think I'll hand over back to David. In case there might be questions.
Well, thanks very much, Kurt, and thank you, Johanna, as well. I understand that there are hundreds of people that have tuned in the virtual world, and we also have the pleasure of the company of a good turnout of people here in person in Paris. Now's the opportunity for questions and answers, and we have received a number of questions over email and through WebEx. So we'll work through some of those questions. I'll begin with two questions that have come in, and then perhaps see if there's anyone in the room that would like to ask a further question, and then we'll go back to some of the other questions that have come in on WebEx. And we'll work through as many of those as we can, time permitting. One of the questions that has come in is as follows. Your analysis reveals that only limited progress is being made with the use of taxes as environmental policy instruments. What ways do you see for strengthening momentum for energy taxation? Kurt, perhaps you would like to take that one.
Well, yeah, thank you. That's, of course, in a sense, the million-dollar question immediately. It's true, we see limited progress in terms of the aggregate profiles. I would like to reiterate that at the same time we see in a range of countries, we see efforts to at least make a beginning with improved carbon pricing, so we should not ignore that. And we see in a smaller set of countries really very ambitious trajectories for carbon pricing being laid out. What's the reason why we don't observe that much progress between 2012 and 2015 and even after, and what can we do about it? Well, I mean, I guess the political economy concerns are usually a big part of the answer. So concerns about competitiveness, about equity impacts, sometimes make progress difficult. But there may be other elements still as well. So what can we do to move forward? Well, I mean, it may be a strange thing to say for those of us that work on climate and environment every day, but my experience is that you don't have to go very far outside these circles to kind of get the question, you know, what's the big deal? What should we be worried about here? So raising awareness of climate challenges still remains important, and of, you know, the nature of the challenge. As I said before, it's not just correcting a system, it's transforming a system. So that awareness needs to be raised still more. There is also, I think, still a job to be done in terms of raising awareness of the very high health costs that are related to air pollution. This is not an issue in the future, this is an issue now. where environmental taxation can play a role as well, where environment policy in general is needed. So that awareness needs to be raised even more. So the OECD did a report for a G20 last year, which was called Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth, which kind of lays out a couple of the issues, how economic development, economic growth in general can be joined up with climate policy. So that awareness needs to grow even more. Then the second question is, okay, there is a job to be done climate and air pollution wise, for example. And then the question is, how do you do that? What policy instruments do you use? It's not straightforward to everyone that taxes are great policy instruments that you should use before all other ones. People tend to think of regulation, tend to think of more invasive measures as the first ones that could help further environmental goals. So the awareness that taxes are very effective in terms of reaching environmental goals, and that they're also very cost effective, I think we need to keep explaining this and need to keep making that case even more than we do. The cost efficiency issue, taxes help us reach environmental goals, but they also do so at lower cost than other policy instruments in most cases. This is something that becomes important if you have very ambitious policy goals for environment and for climate. So the use of taxes, we need to keep explaining that this will help us get us where we want to be at the lowest possible cost to society. A third thing is, and I mentioned it, and this relates to this Paris collaborative idea, environment policy is also tax policy. And there's really no harm in terms of being aware, I think, that if you're going to introduce environmental taxes, energy taxes, more than we currently do, that there will be quite a bit of revenue that is going to be raised. And revenue is interesting from a tax policy angle, because most tax policy exists actually not to change behavior, but to raise revenue. Raising revenue is an important public function. Environmental taxes have a role to play in there. I think if we manage to make the case more than we do, we try to do it already, but if we manage to make the case more than we do, that environmental tax policy is really a core element of tax policy in general, then I think we can create a more cross-government support for the use of environmental taxes and maybe make more headway than we currently do. So these are some high-level elements answering your question, hopefully.
Well, thanks very much, Kurt. And I'm going to come back to you with a couple of questions that are related that have come in through WebEx. One question that we've received, and I think it'll be best if you can answer these together. The first question that has come in from one participant was, in the graphs, we see that countries where taxes are particularly low, and they cite a number, are non-EU countries, and countries where taxes are higher include a lot of EU countries. Is this difference mostly due to the EU ETS? So I'll let you answer that in a moment. I think you've partly already answered that. But then a question that is related to that from another person. It's clear that progress in energy taxation is poor. This is worrying, unless if the growth in carbon pricing through ETSs outpaces the tax stagnation. So it would be interesting to supplement the tax data with the ETS data, which we do in effective carbon rates. In other words, do you know when an update of the report on effective carbon rates will be published? And also with which data or what year will the data be from for that report? So over to you, Kurt.
So thank you for these questions, and I'm going to probably start with the second one. Do improvements in trading systems outpace the growth that we see in tax systems? Well, I mean, this is indeed the analysis. This is why we do the effective carbon rates work. We want to be able to compare these different components of carbon pricing policy. The 2016 edition showed us that it's really not the case that ETSs are moving faster than taxation in general. I mean, if you want to compare what are nominally called carbon prices to what are called emission trading systems, then it's less clear, and it really depends on the country and on the region that you're looking at. But in general, to say that ETSs pick up a job where taxes leave off, I don't think you can say that. That's not what we found in the first edition of effective carbon rates. And anticipating somewhat on what we're going to be saying in the new edition, it doesn't look like the statement will be any different, to be honest. So there is progress with the use of trading systems, as there is progress with the use of taxes, but it's not like it's going to give us a structural change in the use of carbon pricing in the periods that we're looking at. What period will be covered in the new edition of effective carbon rates that we're going to be looking at? Well, I mean, we'll use the 2015 tax data, and we'll look at trading systems as they existed in 2015, but also looking forward a little bit. So something new that we are planning to do in effective carbon rates 2018 is that we're hoping to kind of look forward a bit more, and looking forward then will mean looking at 2018. I'm looking at Florence here because he's leading that work at the moment. So we will look at 2018. We'll obviously not be able to do that in the same depth and in the same detail as we look at 2015, but nevertheless, we'll try to get some highlights, try to get some, let's say, estimate of the state of carbon pricing in 2018. And that's what will come after summer. As I said in my notes, in my remarks earlier, I don't think we'll see a sea change looking past 2015 compared to 2012, or 2018 compared to 2015 either. Then there was a question about low taxes outside the EU, higher in the European Union. Is this because of the EU ETS? No, I mean, the EU ETS is not covered in taxing energy use. So this is not why you see these higher prices in the EU. There are actually quite simply much higher energy taxes in the European Union than in most non-EU countries, including high-income non-EU countries. Why is this? Well, I mean, this reflects partly different views, different approaches to taxation in general. We all know that taxes tend to be higher in European contexts than in many non-EU OECD countries. So it's partly reflective of tax traditions in general. It is also partly reflective of different approaches to environment policy. So, for example, in the USA, there is a view that much environment policy, to the extent that it is done through taxes, is mostly through tax incentives rather than setting tax rates. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that environment policy less often takes the form of taxation in the US than it does in many European countries. We can discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the different approaches. The remark that I made earlier about, it's not just about awareness of environment policy, but also how you go about environment policy. If you use taxes, your policy is going to be more cost effective. So to the extent that you think cost effectiveness is important, we think that giving a stronger role for taxes in many cases is a good idea.
Thanks, Kurt. Now we'll provide those of you that are here in Paris with an opportunity to ask a question. Does anyone have a question? We have many more that have come through on WebEx, so don't feel under any pressure. But thank you for your attendance. Is there anyone that has? Niels Axel.
Thank you, and thank you to Kurt and Johanna and David for interesting presentations. One little point in relation to what has been said of the importance of emission trading systems compared to taxes on energy, be they called carbon taxes or be they called something else. it's absolutely correct, as you have stated, that emission trading systems don't change the picture on average. But isn't it also fair to say that in some non-road sectors, emission trading systems actually do contribute quite significantly to the carbon price signals that exist? Thank you.
Kurt.
Yes, that is correct. So there are regions and countries and the European Union, for example, California, to name just a couple, where emission trading systems are important policy instruments to try to put prices on carbon. Are these prices high enough? Well, we know from the effective carbon rates work that no, they're not. So, I mean, they do contribute in several places, but I mean, the overall conclusion remains that they don't change the aggregate picture by as much as one would like or hope. So yeah, and an additional remark to be made there, which is a little bit related to our view of what constitutes a tax signal on carbon prices. We don't just look at carbon prices, carbon taxes, we also look at excise taxes because we think economically they are equivalent, they send very similar signals. One issue there in relation to emission trading systems is that, you know, the coordination between emission trading systems and carbon taxes often is on policymakers' minds. The coordination between excise taxes and emission trading systems usually is not on policymakers' minds, and that sometimes poses problems in terms of the alignment between the different components of the full carbon price.
Are there any other questions from within the room? Yes.
Thanks, and congrats on the nice report.
If you could just come forward to the microphone. Thanks.
I'm just wondering whether or not there is any current or future work to measure subsidies, because if the idea is beyond carbon pricing to look at, you know, consumption patterns, changes in energy consumption, then we consider both the taxes, the carbon price, and the subsidies. So just wondering what's going on there. Thanks.
Yes, I mean, very good point, and I probably should have mentioned it earlier, but there is work ongoing in the OECD on fossil fuel support. So this is being measured and tracked. We are following up, well, we colleagues in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate are following up on this and keeping track of what's going on there. You know, I mean, the recent indications were that there were reductions in fossil fuel support. But of course, these took place in a time when crude oil prices were quite low. So maybe there's a connection between those two observations there. So I guess we'll have to wait and see for the next update in terms of what happens to the evolution of fossil fuel support. I mean, it's very much an issue which again also relates to this budgetary view or fiscal policy view of carbon pricing and fossil fuel support. I think where you see reform in terms of reducing fossil fuel subsidies, and we can think of Mexico, we can think of Indonesia, this is partly a climate and an environment policy, but it's to a very large extent budget policy, because this is where spending can be reduced or can be diverted to other well, important expenditure items, including in the case of Indonesia, for example, education and infrastructure. So it's as much budgetary policy there as environment policy, which is a good thing as long as it changes in the right direction.
And that question actually echoes almost word for word a question that came in on WebEx. So I'm sure that there were plenty of people out there very keen to hear that answer, Kurt. Another question that has come in related in particular, Johanna, to slide 11. And the question was, I'm surprised to learn that diesel is supposedly taxed higher than gasoline. My knowledge is that it is mostly the other way around, which then spurs demand for reducing diesel subsidies. Perhaps, Johanna, I know you did explain that, but perhaps you could provide a little bit more of an explanation as to why that slide showed what it did.
So yeah, thank you for the question. That's indeed something that we've been quite surprised to learn when we looked at the data. And it actually is the case that 40 out of the 42 countries that we analyze in the report tax diesel at a lower effective and statutory rate than gasoline. And that is actually counterintuitive to what environmental policy considerations would suggest, because diesel does have a higher carbon content than gasoline per liter. But then also the larger impacts, so the larger environmental impact of diesel combustion are larger than for gasoline. So actually, environmental policy considerations would suggest that diesel should be taxed at least as highly as gasoline, or higher actually. So many countries are actually now making or implementing policy to narrow the differential taxation between gasoline and diesel. So just as a few examples is Belgium, France, and then also Mexico actually made the narrowing of the diesel differential an explicit objective of the environmental policy reform that we mentioned earlier. So now in Mexico, for example, diesel is taxed at a higher effective rate than gasoline per ton of carbon. So why actually do we see the result on the slide the way we see it? So here we see that on the aggregate, when we look at the 42 countries together, diesel is taxed at a higher effective rate than gasoline. This is mainly because of the different weights that countries take when we look at the aggregate data. So one exception to the pattern next to Mexico of taxing diesel at a higher effective rate than gasoline, when we just look at the carbon content, is the United States. And the United States actually accounts for 45% of gasoline emissions across the 42 countries. And that is why their weight in this total is relatively high. So when we look at the aggregate picture, we see the picture that way. And then on top of that, we actually see that many of the countries that tax the gasoline at higher effective rates are relatively heavy diesel users. So that again plays in the picture when we look at how the different weights play out when we look across the 42 countries. So this result is counterintuitive at first. You'll see that in the report we have a few figures where the diesel differential, as we call it, is shown in different directions. In this case, it's that way. In the EU countries, for example, you'll see that gasoline is taxed at a high effective rates in all of the countries. Yeah, just as a policy consideration, so France, for example, is one of the countries that is narrowing this differential gradually over time. So this is something that can be maybe an interesting policy for other countries too.
Okay, are there any further questions from inside the room? If not, there is. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one technical clarification. When I calculated effective tax rate in euros per ton of CO2 or per ton of benzene, gasoline, whatever, have you applied nominal exchange rate for other countries outside Eurozone? Thank you.
So we use the exchange rates, so the average exchange rates across the year of 2015. And when we compare really the countries, we have taken into account inflation across the 2 years. And we show, so for example, the second slide comparing change, these were shown in 2012 prices using the 2015 exchange rate for all of the countries.
Now, I think perhaps this is a good question to end on. The questioner has asked, what are the prospects for higher carbon pricing? How will governments get there? And has the Paris Agreement had any effect? Over to you, Kurt.
So thanks for that question. I mean, we've spoken about it a little bit, but your question mentions the Paris Agreement, and has the Paris Agreement made a difference here? Well, obviously it has made quite a bit of difference. The entire momentum in terms of climate policy and the way countries go about trying to coordinate policy between them has gone through a very big change and a very big increase in momentum with the Paris Agreement. Does it by itself point to a stronger role for pricing or taxation or trading systems? It does not in itself do that, no, but it certainly allows for more flexibilities within countries and coordination, cooperation across countries to use pricing instruments. So I guess the challenge is to maintain this momentum. This is not straightforward. I mean, we all know of evolutions in various countries that maybe go in the opposite direction a little bit, and but at the same time there are countries that do keep pushing for climate policy and for the use of prices within climate policy. I've mentioned France as a clear example. I've mentioned Canada as a clear example. So there is momentum, and we have reason to hope that this will remain. So I think the role of the Paris Agreement cannot be underestimated, but I would say that it provides a framework. It points to the possible role of market-based instruments, so prices as instruments for environment policy, but then leaves it to the countries to take it from there and to develop their strategies. And this, again, is one of the reasons why we think that integrating pricing and tax policy in one kind of integrated approach to climate policy and to budget policy, tax policy, is one way to strengthen momentum and to kind of move climate policy and environment policy in general from an environmental issue, which it definitely is, but to a more general economic structural policy issue that we think it should become.
Now, I did get a little ahead of myself because we have another question from the room.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and it looks extremely interesting. I'm also particularly interested on the political economy aspects. So there's a lot here on the what and the analysis of that. And you've alluded in your slides that you also have work on political economy. So I just wanted to ask, what would you say are some of the key drivers of positive reform that you've seen in some of the slides with the 4 or 5 countries that have increased over time? And just to maybe also note to the listeners outside that there will be a Green Growth Sustainable Development Forum on the political economy of green growth here at the OECD at the end of November.
So thanks for that question. I mean, I think in essence, the driver of positive reform is an awareness that you can combine climate policy with economic growth policy and with inclusive economic growth policy. I think from the moment that you have an awareness across policymakers that indeed this is possible and that you can go beyond, oppositions and big trade-offs, and you can go beyond and see actually synergies between all of these issues. That is the basis for going forward, and that makes positive reform possible. Now, our role in that is, I think, to kind of provide evidence of the fact that these trade-offs are actually not that strong and that there are actually synergies. And that's what our work on incidence does. For example, it shows that carbon prices in some cases are a little bit regressive, but not nearly as regressive as people often think they are. So there's a working paper on that. Then there's the issue of energy affordability. So we have to drive up the prices of carbon-intensive fuels if we want to reduce their demand. Is this going to cause problems in terms of energy affordability, which at current prices already poses an issue in some countries for some households? Clearly, if you're going to increase the prices, this will become more of an issue. So what do you do? Well, we have kind of this working paper on that, which simulates an energy tax reform and points out that if you take about 30% of the increased tax revenues from your tax reform, that then that will not only allow you to keep affordability at levels where they currently are, but actually to improve it. So you need, the basic message is you need some of the revenue to tackle that issue, but not even nearly all of it, and you can do other things as well. So that's kind of what we point out there. The other big issue in terms of competitiveness is usually in terms of political economy is competitiveness. Is short-run competitiveness an issue? Well, the evidence says that at the current carbon prices, actually not really. At high carbon prices, well, maybe for a couple of firms, and I heard people say yesterday in a meeting that maybe for 5% of firms, this might be an immediate issue if energy prices go up strongly. Okay, that's something that we should be able to handle if we increase carbon prices gradually. In the long run, and I go back to where I started, in the long run, if you think you can have growth and inclusive transition at the same time, then competitiveness policy means preparing your industry for that low carbon environment. That's true competitiveness policy in the long run. How do you do that? Well, you do all kinds of things, but a strong carbon price is part of it.
Thanks very much, Kurt. A great way to wrap things up. Before I hand back to Kumi to summarise and conclude, we have also had a number of questions come in on Twitter, and those that we've not been able to respond to, we will try and respond to after the event. But I note that there was one in particular about the references to 30 euros per tonne being an estimate of the climate cost. We would just emphasise that at all times we refer to that as a low-end estimate, and we clearly acknowledge that there are a range of views about what might be the appropriate level to price that at. But I think 30 euros per tonne is quite conservative, and that needs to be borne in mind when reflecting upon these results. But I'll hand back to you, Kumi.
Okay, thank you. Just to add at the end that, the OECD is here to provide this type of evidence base because there's a perception out there that strong climate policy might have negative impacts on certain sectors of economy or household budget, whatever. But this is exactly the type of work that we try to provide by keeping track of evidence and tax rates and other aspects. So thank you very much for our colleagues from the Center for Tax Policy today for joining our Green Talk Live. Thanks, David and Kurt and Johanna. We'll wrap up today, but for next month, Green Talk Live will be addressing leveraging the smart grid. It's going to be taking place on the 15th of March at 5 o'clock Paris time. And then you can register at the address that's shown online for those who are interested. Thank you very much.